Welcome, everyone. My name is Rachel. My pronouns are she, her, and I will be the moderator for today's special event. In celebration of World Space Week, we will be joined today by Canadian astronaut Joshua Kutryk. I begin by acknowledging that I'm on the ancestral lands and territories of the Anishinaabe Nation, which includes the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. The Ontario Science Centre is located in Toronto, which is governed by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant. As a settler, I'm grateful to be able to live and work on this land alongside the Indigenous peoples with whom we peaceably share this land and we've cared for it since time immemorial. I also encourage all of us today to reflect on the language of space exploration and how it's often similar to the language of colonization. Some of you may be joining from other locations today. We're always encouraged to find out more about the peoples, treaties, and lands that we live on. There are several resources available, and ones that I've found really helpful are the websites whos.land and native-land.ca. As I mentioned previously, I am so thrilled to introduce astronaut Joshua Kutryk. Joshua is a test pilot, fighter pilot, and engineer, and was selected by the Canadian Space Agency to be an astronaut candidate and joined the 2017 NASA astronaut class. After 2 years of intensive training, Joshua obtained the official title of astronaut in January 2020 and is currently waiting for his first flight assignment. Welcome, Joshua, and thank you so much for taking the time to be with us all today.
Hi. Yeah, no problem at all. Thanks for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to talk about what is really my favorite subject, and that's space and science and exploring. So I'm really looking forward to this afternoon's discussion. Thank you for the invite, and thanks for having me.
We're so excited. Thank you. Now, everyone, we welcome all of your questions and comments. Feel free to start entering them in the chat. While we're open to respectful dialogue and discussion, of course, inappropriate comments will be blocked to ensure a safe, inclusive, and enjoyable experience for all of our viewers. Now, we're going to start off with some questions that we received in advance from our members and teachers. And we received many questions, Joshua, about your training. Some came from a grade 5 class at Forest Glen Public School. And also we saw questions coming in from Madison and Stephen and Mishti, all wanting to know what type of training do they give you before you become a certified astronaut? How do you become an astronaut?
Yeah, wow. That's a good place to start. And the simple answer is that there's a lot of training. And that's probably something to emphasize right at the beginning, is that to do this job, it's a job I wanted to do since I was a child, but to do it, you really do have to like learning. I still consider myself to be very much a new astronaut. I was hired in 2017. And like you alluded to, I've done a lot of training since then. Basic astronaut training, in a sense, is sort of like going back to university. So you go back into an environment where you're a student, you're going to classes every day, you're doing simulators every day, practical tests, that kind of thing. But it's exciting because it's stuff that we're very interested in, but there's also a really large diversity to the subject matter. So if I was just to give you some samples of what we study in basic astronaut training, I mean, there's a lot of technical subject matter, everything to do with the International Space Station, space vehicles. There's theory, there's orbital mechanics, there's teamwork skills. Actually, we spend a lot of time practicing and refining our ability to work in groups. We spend a lot of time training in other languages. So many of us speak one or two, obviously, many of us two already. We learn a third, which is Russian, because you need to be able to understand Russian to operate on the International Space Station. And then there's a whole bunch of other things that we learn: spacewalking, we learn science, we study geology. The list goes really on, but the takeaway, I think, is that there's a lot to it. It takes years to become qualified at the basic level as an astronaut, like I am, and then many years more beyond that, actually, training specifically for a long duration space mission.
That's also interesting, and you have to have some kind of natural curiosity about all those things too, to want to sort of go back and learn all of them and be clearly very motivated as you are. Now, I think the number one question that we were receiving, and we're seeing some of that coming in through the live chat as well, is came in from some students at grade 9 science class at Willowwood School. Also, we saw this question come in from Scarlett, Sarah, Alex, and Ved. How do astronauts use the toilet in space?
Scarlett, Sarah, Alex, and Ved, and everyone else who asked this question, thanks for your interest, and thanks for asking the question. I mean, physiologically, we use the washroom the same way, but it's a lot more complicated, as you can imagine, because there's no place for the waste to go. And so, the first question today was about training, and believe it or not, there's a lot of training that's focused on just that part of things, which is to say the technological apparatus that makes this all happen. So right now on space station, there's 2 toilets. The second one was actually just recently put there. For the last 20 years, there's only been one. But basically, it's a cubicle you go into, surrounded by complicated equipment, and you do your number 1 or your number 2 in much the same way as you do on Earth. But there's a couple other neat things associated with it. And one of the things that I find most interesting actually is the recycling bit. So urine is recycled on the International Space Station. It's very true now to say that someone's urine is almost 100% recycled, to the point where in the next couple of days you're basically drinking that again as water. And I like that example because it shows you a technological benefit. Something that we've really helped figure out from our work in space is that living in a closed system where we're really maximizing the efficiency with which we use all our resources, like water. When it comes to human waste and going to the bathroom, we're recycling a lot of it, and you're using it over and over and over again. So, you do your number 1 or 2 the same way you do on Earth, but to enable some of that other recycling, there's a lot of technology that goes into it and helps you out.
What a great innovation and demonstration of sustainability to really come up with a way to recycle urine.
Yeah.
So we got another question from Mrs. Welch's class at Mohawk Garden Public School, and also from Aiden from the Learning Common. Do you get Wi-Fi in space?
You sure do. So it's obviously complicated, but at the end of the day, there is internet access on board. Here in Houston, actually, where I live and train and work, we work daily supporting operations on the International Space Station. There's huge amounts of data that go back and forth because the space station is just so immensely complicated that we have to sort of drive it and control it for the most part from the ground. And a little bitty part of that data that goes back and forth is normal internet that the astronauts have to use. Of course, it's not as simple as just sending it in a wire. That the space station is going around the Earth, every 90 minutes, going 28,000 kilometers an hour, and it's basically being handed off in terms of signal, in terms of internet signal, from all these other satellites that are in space to make this happen. So as the space station zips around the planet, it's always being handed off from one communication satellite to the other as it goes around. And through a network like that, the internet signal goes from the International Space Station to these satellites down to Houston, and then vice versa. But if you're an astronaut on the ISS these days, you do have access to internet, and it's quite convenient. So for even myself, working with the folks who are on orbit on a daily basis, it's not unusual at all to get a phone call from them, to have your phone ring and it's the space station, or to have a video call, just in the same way that we're doing it now. You have to make sure that all the satellites are going to be just where they need to be to support the call. But we have experts who do that, and at the end of the day, there's internet.
Perfect. That's so great to hear. I'm sure that's great for the astronauts who feel like they have a way to stay connected and connect with people on Earth, and possibly even their families and friends at times.
Definitely. I think you raise a pretty important point, actually, because just in the last, when I was a kid interested in space, Canadian astronauts were going on shuttle missions to and from orbit, to and from ISS, but they were typically 10 or 12 days long. And in just the last 10 years, that has completely changed, so that now everyone who goes to space almost is going on what we call long duration increments or exploration missions. And a normal mission now is 6, 7, 8 months. It's not even unnormal for astronauts to be in space for a year. And so things like this internet question, they're not trivial. They're very important for the reasons that you mentioned.
We have a question from Kayla from Mohawk Public School in Burlington. And I think this is such a great question that I'm really curious about. Do you know what slime would look like in space?
I guess it depends on the kind of slime, Michaela. But typically fluids look very, very different in space, and you've probably seen pictures of water or toothpaste or anything else, maybe in videos from the International Space Station. But the space station, of course, it's not that there's no gravity there, but that there's no effective gravity because the space station is basically perpetually falling around the Earth, and so the result of that is that fluids don't behave like they do on here. If you were to take slime, for example, in your question, and take it out of the container and just let it be, on Earth it's probably more viscous than water, but it's still somewhat of a fluid that might flow down onto the floor and then spread out flat. But that all of that we know here in our earthly experience is due to gravity, and without it, it's very, very different. So the same slime in space wouldn't slide off and go to the floor. It would probably just coalesce itself into a ball, several balls, and it would float away and it would be gone. And so that's a big challenge for us as astronauts dealing with water and toothpaste and everything else that we use on a day-to-day basis. We can't deal with it like we do here on Earth. It has to be very specially packaged and operated with.
We actually have a question related to that about how water behaves in space. Someone wanted to know, how do astronauts shower?
Mm-hmm. How do astronauts shower? I would say two things. The first is that they probably don't shower as typically as you would think, and the reason is that, like we were saying, sustainability, water availability on ISS is a very key consideration. It's a scarcity, and so we don't shower that often. We don't wash clothes that often, so it's a bit of a dirty, smelly environment. I mean, astronauts will typically wear one set of clothing for probably much longer than you care to know, or than you would ever wear it for here on Earth, and then it's garbage, and they put a new set on and wear it for another many day segment. So the first part of the question is, we save on water by not showering that often. The second answer, in terms of how it's actually done, we can't shower like we do here on Earth. If you turn the shower head on, the water would just be, millions, thousands of balls of little water droplets that would be gone into the electronics of the space station. It would cause fires and corrosion, and ultimately it would cause the end of the space station. So astronauts basically take sponge baths, kind of the way that you might wash when you're camping, or that you might bathe a very small child or a baby. You can think of using things like wet wipes and sponges to basically just wipe yourself down with moist, damp material, as opposed to actually using liquid water, because that's just something you can't do without gravity there to help.
Yeah, that's really good to know. We have a number of people asking, with regards to your training, how long do you have to train? You mentioned there's like an intensive period that's kind of like you go back to school, but the training does continue. So we got a question from Sophie, age 6. How long training takes typically?
Hi, Sophie, and thank you for your question. How much training? So the simple answer would be about 6 or 7 years. So if you look at an astronaut that goes to the International Space Station, for example, or that might go to the moon, we're getting ready to do that. If you take all the training that they do and you could put it back to back to back, it would be about 6 or 7 years. But to dive into that just a little more, we don't do it all back to back to back. We kind of do it in about 3 phases. And I'm sort of in the middle of those 3 phases right now. So at the beginning, we do nothing but train, and that's our basic astronaut training. It takes 2.5 years. You're just a full-time student at NASA. Once you graduate from that, you go into the middle part, which is where I am right now, and that's sort of a mix. You continue to train with about half your time you're still training, but with the other half your time you're doing technical jobs at NASA. You're working in jobs that are done by astronauts here on the ground, so testing and helping to design and develop new space technologies, supporting the astronauts on orbit, communicating with them, all that kind of stuff. So you train and you work. And then in the third part, once you're assigned to a mission, you go back to full-time student, which is just training, and you do that for probably another 2 or 2.5 years, and then you launch on a rocket. So altogether, it's a lot. It's 6 or 7 years, but we kind of break it up and mix it around a little bit.
That's good to know. Thanks for sharing that. You mentioned something in there about preparing possibly to go to the moon. Do you want to go to the moon someday? That's a question that came in from Tyler from Bill Crothers Secondary School in Unionville.
Tyler in Unionville. Yeah, it's good to hear these places because it makes me miss home. And so, anyway, would you want to go to the moon? Would I want to go to the moon? Doesn't everybody want to go to the moon? I don't know. I
Just
certainly would
ask our
love to.
audience.
Yeah,
How many
I
of you would
would.
raise your hand?
I mean, I've as a child, I just remember being fascinated by exploring and by curiosity, and the moon is the ultimate destination for me from both of those perspectives. So the answer to the question is definitely yes. I don't know that I will, but I do know that Canada and the spacefaring nations of the world, the partnerships we work in with these other countries, that is what we're working on right now. Down here at NASA, this is the environment I get to live and work in. I see the buildings and the labs every day where this stuff is being built to take humans back to the moon. And it's happening, I find, quicker than many people think. So we are looking at the first uncrewed mission back to the moon launching later this year. It's called Artemis 1. It's a test flight of some of this technology. But then shortly after that, in 2023, probably near the end of 2023, will be Artemis 2. And that's going to take 4 human beings back to lunar orbit. It'll be the first time humans have been back there since the Apollo program. These 4 people are going to go further and faster than any human being in the history of our species has ever gone. And we know that there'll be a Canadian on that flight. So, the point I try to make with people is that moon exploration is happening now. This is the era for the return to the moon. Canada's a partner in that, and that means that if you are interested in space, or you do dream of going to places like that someday, your timing is really, really good if you're a young person in Canada right now.
That's so exciting. And we're seeing a lot of people responding that yes, they want to go to the moon, just like you do, Joshua. Some have some concerns about maybe not being able to shower. Some really would love to have a moon rock, which I don't think you would get to keep if you went to the moon, but still pretty cool to see. Absolutely. And Lily, age 7, says maybe she would go to the moon if her mommy and daddy could come with her. So that's very
That
sweet. Thank
might
you
be
all.
possible someday.
Thank you all for sharing in those comments. Let's see, we're getting so many wonderful questions coming in. Oh, here's a great one from Zadie, 7 years old, wants to know, have any reptiles or amphibians been to space? I know there's been some animals on the space station.
Yeah, so that's a very specific question, and I'm always amazed by the curiosity of young people, and that curiosity never fails to ponder up a question that I don't know the answer to, and this is one of those. You were so specific. I don't know. Actually, I'm thinking as I talk here, but I don't know with certainty if there's been a reptile. There have definitely been animals. I mean, if you go back far enough to early space exploration, before we trusted the technology enough to put humans on it, you have to remember we had no idea what would happen outside of the Earth's atmosphere, whether or not it was even possible for a human to stay alive. And so we did send animals at that time in space exploration, but animals have made the trip since then. There's a lot of science that has to do with animals, and so animals have certainly been to space and back. But has one of them ever been a reptile? I don't know.
I don't know that either.
I would
That's
have
a
to
really
call
great
a friend on
question.
that one. Yeah.
We got a similar question from another grade 5 student as well, asking about have any animals been to space and what kind. So lots of people interested about animals going to space. So great question, everyone. And yes, they have been.
Mm-hmm.
We have a number of people asking Joshua about What games can you play in space? Actually, this is from Anna from a grade 4 student, pardon me. What games can you play in space? Is it possible to play a board game?
So it's definitely possible to play games so long as you have a way of holding on to all the pieces, because if you don't, they'll be gone and you'll never see them again. The space station is huge. It's the size of a football field, and it's immensely complicated in terms of things like air movement and filtration systems. So if you had a normal board game and you just opened it up, the players would all be gone, and you'd never see them again. But if you had a way of maybe Velcro or tape to keep the pieces on the board, then you'd be fine. If you had cards, for example, that's something that you can play, and that does get played. Astronauts on the International Space Station have time off, just like you might expect they would here on Earth, and so certainly. Games that are conducive to being played in microgravity are there and are used. So if you want to think about the entertainment like playing cards or even reading books, there's instruments on board, there's guitars, music, things like that, all things that astronauts use sometimes in their pastime as a distraction. But you have to have a way to keep track of the pieces.
That's a great question, and thanks for letting us know about that, Joshua. We're seeing a lot of questions coming into related to food in space. And so Quinn, age 9, wants to know, does space food have flavor? Some others are curious about how you can eat in space. I'm aware that actually some fresh food is able to get to the space station from time to time as well.
Mm-hmm. Food's a very important thing when we talk about space exploration, and it's a very challenging thing for probably two or three reasons. The first is that it's very important. So, and you know, it's very important from a physical perspective, from being healthy, but it's also very important. It turns out on missions that are 6 years or a year and 6 months, sorry, or 12 months in duration. It's very important also from a motivational perspective, from a mental health perspective. These are things that we're starting to learn now with space exploration, but that we kind of always knew if we go back and look at Arctic or Antarctic exploration. When people are away in hazardous environments for years at a time, food is really critical, not only because from a physical point of view, but from a mental. So we have to get it right. And then some of the other reasons it's challenging to get right is because, of course, ISS is so far away. It's very expensive to launch stuff to space. You know, we're talking tens of thousands of dollars for a pound of food, for example. So when we try to solve this food problem, we have to make sure that it's light. It has to be compact so that we can launch it, but it also has to be nutritious. It has to be tasty, to answer your question there, so that an astronaut who's been on board for 12 months will eat it and will want to eat it. And it has to be relatively easy to prepare. I guess that would be the third challenge, because again, of the challenges that we've already mentioned today to do with the microgravity environment. So there's some background on food. What you end up with at the end of the day is food that you might be a little bit familiar with if you've ever seen camping food or dehydrated food. A lot of the food is simply dehydrated, and most of it is prepared actually by adding hot water through a very special little device that we have on board, or by putting it in a very special little oven that then just warms it up, or then we add water to it. You want to think of kind of taking the majority of your food, the majority of your meals out of tubes or out of plastic bags, that kind of thing, to manage the microgravity environment. And so, I mean, I would say at the end of the day, it looks different, it's prepared different, but in my experience training with it here on the ground, it's actually quite good. It tastes good, and it's certainly very nutritious. I mean, there's entire teams that work on this problem down here at Johnson Space Center. There's a food laboratory where they design this stuff, and if you're an astronaut in training, you actually get to go there, and you get to spend a lot of time trying this food and trying to get comfortable with it, and trying to figure out for yourself what you are going to be able to eat a lot of and what you're not. So it's a you know, kind of like the bathroom question. It's something that on Earth is just so trivial, we don't think about it, but in space it's very complicated, and we have to get it right.
Thank you for that, and thank you everyone for those questions. This question came in from Sonia. Joshua, what is your favorite thing about your job?
I really like
Hard to
my
pick
job.
just one.
Yeah, I mentioned already how I've always been curious and wanting to explore, and this job definitely lets me do that. Of course, with the space mission, but also on a day-to-day basis, just in terms of what I get to work with here in Houston and be a part of, and what I get to learn and study. Um, I think that considering that that's what I like, exploring and learning about new things. The best part of this job on a purely individual level is the diversity of what I get to do. So, and I'm very fortunate, blessed to have that. But there's no 2 days down here that are really the same. It's always different. It's always very exciting, but it's always different. So today, I'm having this conversation with you folks. I'll be, as soon as I leave this, I'll actually be flying a helicopter as part of a helicopter training program that we're running. Um, I'll be flying a T-38 later this week. Next week I'll be in a mission control simulation that is a full mission launch rendezvous with the ISS scenario that takes place over about 12 hours. I'll be underwater during one of the days next week for about 6 hours simulating a spacewalk in what we call the neutral buoyancy laboratory down here. So every day is different, but awesome, and I think that's how I'd answer it. It's the diversity of stuff we get to do.
That sounds incredible. And I mentioned at the beginning that Joshua was a test pilot, so that's great that you're still getting lots of opportunity to fly.
Yeah, I'm lucky for that.
Wonderful. All right, we're seeing some questions coming in fast and furious now. Thank you so much, everyone, for these wonderful questions. We have a few questions with regards to accessibility and inclusion. One person asks, Cleo, age 11, wants to know if a person in a wheelchair could go to space. And Inaya, 9 years old from Mississauga, as a non-speaker autistic, could I join the Canadian Space Agency and go to space?
Yeah, you could certainly join the Canadian Space Agency. We have I would answer that in the sense that we all think it's important for everybody to be able to someday have these opportunities, and that's one of the motivations behind the very essence of the space program. We're always working to be more inclusive and to design an environment and future missions that are more inclusive. It's been a long road, of course, and it's a very difficult one, and that the truth of the matter is that right now we're still at the very, very beginning of this space exploration era. And if you look at a country like Canada, we've still had very, 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 very few people go. If you've had to have been one of the luckiest people in the country really to do it. I think if you look at government astronauts for Canada, we just passed the 10 mark in our entire history. We're talking about 10 people. So we're very, very, very early on that, but the intent, of course, is to create an environment where everyone can be a part of this, and that's true on the government side. But right now, it's also really neat to point out, I think, that on the private side, we're seeing that. Inspiration 4 just came back. If you follow this stuff in the U.S., that was the first flight of someone with a prosthetic limb, and then we also have that SpaceX, but we have all these other companies now like Virgin Galactic and Blue Origin also holding to that as their vision, the idea of getting as much of humanity, the outer space experience, or to space and back as they can. And so up till now, it's been very difficult for almost anyone, but we're trying to change that. And if you're a young person in Canada, I think you're going to see a lot of change there over the course of your life going forward.
Thank you for those wonderful questions. We have another question with regards to how do astronauts protect their mental health? Do they get lonely or scared in space?
Okay, there's a lot to that question. So mental health is something that's important to us. and it's always been a big challenge of exploration, by the way. So we have the challenge now because we send people into orbit for a year at a time. And we're going to have the challenge because NASA's getting ready to send people to the moon and then to Mars in the 2030s. And that's not going to be year-long missions. That's going to be 2.5, even 3 years at a time. So it's something that we as a NASA and its partners like the Canadian Space Agency think about a lot. How do we deal with it? I'd say there's probably two parts to that answer. The first is training, training in mental health awareness and managing your emotions and your feelings and the challenge of being away from home and your loved ones for such a long period of time, and not just of being away, but of working in such high risk and high consequence environments. We train for that. So we train for that through all kinds of different things down here, from classroom sessions to group challenges. We do trips together, crew trips, where we go off and we do a very challenging thing. So maybe we go and we do a caving expedition in Europe was one that I did, or canyon exploring. But the point is not really to explore, it's to go and to interact and to practice this, to practice and to train managing mental health and frustration and fear and all the other emotions that come along with space flight. So I think that's the first part is training and practice, and then the second part is we have to deal with it. We have to recognize it, and we have to have. It's not enough just to recognize. We have to have a very deliberate processes and operations in place to manage people's emotions and mental health on board station during long duration missions. And so we do that through some of the things that we've already talked about, technology wise, with creating an environment where crew members are able to stay in touch like we are today, with video and voice on a daily basis, in fact, with their friends and family and loved ones, conferences, team conferences with people on the ground and with the other crews in orbit, care packages that get sent up to outer space, actually, from people who care about the crew members here on Earth. There's a whole architecture and system put in place there, with the goal of what your question asked, which is helping to keep people healthy, not just physically, but mentally as well in these long missions.
Absolutely. And thank you for that question. And the psychology of it is so important. It's wonderful to hear that there's all of those supports for our astronauts. Muriel, age 9, wants to know, have you always wanted to be an astronaut? And what would you be if you weren't an astronaut?
I have always wanted to be an astronaut, and I think that if I was not an astronaut, I'd still be happy. Before doing this job, I was very fortunate. I was doing what I wanted to do. I was a test pilot. That all came from sort of the passions that I had as a very young person. So ever since I can remember, like I always say, I've been curious. I wanted to explore. At a very young age, I knew that meant I wanted to try to be an astronaut if I could, but I didn't. I don't think I wasn't very forthcoming with that. If you met me when I was 6 years old, I don't think I would have said I want to be an astronaut, because it's so hard to do, and it's still so hard to do. You have to be so very lucky, that I just kind of held on to that in the back of my brain, and because of those same interests, exploring, curiosity, I was drawn to flying. I started flying at a very young age. That was something that sort of channeled that space interest for me, and then I got into experimental flying and high performance flying, and I was very happy doing that, but I did know that at every stage of my life, if I had the chance, I was going to try to do this job. I applied actually in 2009, and I went through the whole selection process, about a year of testing, and I got turned down at the very, very, very end when there were just 4 of us left. And then I went back to my life for another 8 years, and there was another selection. I went through the whole thing again for a year, and out of that one was hired. But definitely something I've always wanted to do. But my advice that I give to people, and it's the advice that I've tried to follow myself, is that if I was ever not able to do this, or if something was to happen now that am no longer able to do this, I want to have made all the decisions in my past life such that whatever else it is that I'm going to be doing instead of being here in this blue suit as this astronaut, I would be fulfilled doing that. And I think I've been successful there. And I think that's an important consideration as you think about what you want to do with your life.
What wonderful advice for Saul to take away. We have time for one more question coming in from Sophia Lila, 6 years old, who is one of our Ontario Science Centre members and wants to be an astronaut. Sophia Lila asks, why does Canada not have its own launch pad, and what space camps can I join at my age?
Sophia, I love the questions, and I think I just want to start off by saying that if you're 6 right now, is what I think I heard, and you're interested in space and you want to be an astronaut, as I said at the beginning, your timing has never been better. We've never had a better place for someone like you to be than in a country like Canada in a year like this, 2021, which is really sort of, I think history will show the start of just this huge move into space that we're going to see. So you have a very bright future ahead of yourself if you want it, and if you are interested in space. Yes, 2 questions. So why does Canada not have its own launch system basically right now? And that's a really good question, especially for a 6-year-old to think of. So good job on thinking about that stuff. I think that someday Canada will. Up till now, it's too complicated. We kind of take it for granted launching things to space, but it's one of the craziest things that we do as human beings in terms of the risk and the money involved and the risk that has to be managed. It's very complicated. You need big governments, you need big partnerships, many countries working together. And so it only happens in a few places around the world. And one of those places right now is the United States, Florida. The other place really is in Russia and Kazakhstan, rather, and then also in countries like China now. So I think someday we will see that come to Canada. It's only a matter of time before the economical aspects make it a good thing for there's going to be a Canadian who wants to do this, and I think we're seeing that happen already. So it will happen, but it's not just quite here yet. We're still early in space exploration as a species, really. The second part of your question, space camps for young people. I would go over to the Canadian Space Agency's website. We actually just over the last year did a program called Junior Astronauts, which was an online program. It wasn't supposed to be that way, but with COVID, it became that way. But we do run a lot of online programs, and there's a lot of online resources. And every now and again, we do something like the Junior Astronauts program, which is basically a space camp for young people. So you should definitely start with that. Start with our website, the Canadian Space Agency's website. And take it from there. You'll find a lot to help you out.
What a great resource, and thank you for those questions, Sophia Lila. Very ambitious for 6 years old, and all of the questions that we've received today are just full of so much excitement and enthusiasm for space, which I think is just wonderful to see. I want to thank you, Joshua, so much for spending this time with us today, and invite our audience to please join me in thanking Joshua for such an awesome session. We're learning all about what it's like to be an astronaut and train like an astronaut. Any final words of advice, Joshua?
Advice. I mean, first I wanted to say thank you. It's always a pleasure to talk to young people, and especially to young Canadians. I miss Canada, and I miss talking to folks like you. So thank you for giving me that opportunity today. Advice. I think that the single most important piece of advice I ever heard was to find something, to pick something, and this is something you should be thinking about no matter how young you are, by the way, but be on the lookout for the thing, the subject that inspires you and interests you and motivates you like nothing else, and because that's the key. Once you find that, you can use that to help you decide what you want to study and what you want to be and where you want to live and what you want to do and what kind of a human you want to be. But that's the key. Find the thing that you can be the most passionate about. I was very lucky to find that at a really young age. It was space, and then it became a little bit more specifically about flying. But that's just me. There's countless other examples, and I'd encourage you all to find yours.
So, so wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you so much to our audience for your awesome questions. Now, I want to ask you, did you all enjoy this session today? For all the teachers out there, we would invite you to please check out our virtual school programs on our website. We have everything from JK to grade 12, and if you book before October 10th, you'll receive a 10% discount. We encourage you to follow us on our social media channels to find out more about upcoming events like this one. And you can also check out our website where you can find many space-related activities and activities related to lots of different science disciplines that you can do at home or in your classroom. We also have time tickets available on our website as well if you would like to come visit us in person. Thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you so much once again to Joshua for his time. Happy World Space Week, everyone.